It's 8 o'clock, you know the drill. That means it's time for a live stream. Good evening. Sorry, I'm a bit hot and it's a bit warm, but I'm hopefully not too disgusting on camera tonight. And actually the camera's angled a bit differently at the moment, so I hope you can see me okay. I'm just gonna get my system up and running, get it all working. Good to see you. Hello, Robert Akers, Nick Husek, Starfire Sounds. Good to see you all. Thanks for tuning in. As always, thank you for tuning in on this actually far cooler Tuesday afternoon than I was expecting, which is just fantastic. Now, I said on last night's stream, which was really annoyingly, the save function on Instagram didn't work properly, so I couldn't get it up on YouTube. So those who follow on YouTube, I'm very sorry, it did not get uploaded. Sometimes Instagram is a bit buggy, and that's called reality. Matey 1964, Matt Music, Whiskey Saurus, 45 Finn, Keegan Evans. Great to see you all. So, tonight I want to touch on the subject of sherry casks. Now, I've talked about sherried whiskies before, and I'm going to talk about some of the other factors to do with sherried whiskies and some of the misinformation I want to touch on that you often hear ambassadors and whiskey hosts say, which is entirely incorrect. So, I have this theory that you either love sherried whiskies, or like you're a die-hard sherry whiskey fan, or they're just a part of the mix of the whiskey world, and you like them. You like bourbon cask whiskeys, like port casks, wine casks, whatever they are, rum casks, muscatel casks, etc., etc., etc. I have this theory that you either love those types of whiskies, like big sherried whiskies. You're like a diehard for them. You track all the Glendronachs and Macallans and Glenfarclases of the world, or you're not. And I'm going to fall into the category of saying that I'm not. I love sherry. I love whiskey, of course. That's what I do. But for sherried whiskies, I enjoy them, especially if they're really well put together sherried whiskies. There was a great thread. There was a thread online on Facebook, on a Facebook group that asked. It was one of those whiskey Facebook groups, and it wasn't the society one. But the question was, what's one of the most controversial opinions you hold in whiskey? And I can't remember, I made 3 points. One is, I think I said, bourbon casks are greater, as in greater than symbol, are greater than wine casks. That's a controversial opinion, but it's not really that controversial, really. But it's like, I think bourbon cask whiskies perform better. Whiskey performs better from every country out of an ex-bourbon barrel rather than an ex-wine cask. The second point I made was that something about how peated whiskies can be a little bit one-dimensional if it's just being smashed with peat. I've talked about this before. I compare peat in whiskey to hops in beer. You can overdo it. You can end up with a one-dimensional whiskey. You can end up with a one-dimensional, just big hops beer, big peated whiskey. Some nuance and some delicate handling of the peat and some restraint in the malting of that barley specification goes a long way. Less is more in that case. And the third point I think I made was about how most sherry casks, and I emphasize the word most sherry casks are hard work. What I meant by that was, and I got a few messages actually, I got a few private messages around that, was about how most sherry cask whiskies, most modern sherry cask whiskies are not much fun. And I said that I've said that a few times. This is actually something that I've also heard whiskey host and extraordinaire ambassador for the whiskey category, Matthew Ferguson Stewart, say a few times as well. Hello, Matthew. I know you sometimes tune in. Good to see. Hope you're here tonight. In that most modern sherried whiskies aren't that great. Now, I'd say we're going through a bit of a transition phase in the Scotch whiskey industry when it comes to sherry casks at the moment. There's two main types of sherry casks, and I don't mean types of sherry. I mean types of sherry cask acquisition. One, some of them come from when I say some, a very small amount come from Jerez. They come from bodegas. They do still sometimes come from those places. They are quite expensive, and they are often have been maturing sherry in a bodega system, a sistema bodega racking system, which I can't explain with just my hands, but I'll show a graphic sometime. Those are sherried whiskies that are often a bit more I'd say, they're much older casks. They're much well-rounded It was on AOS. Sorry, Sable Scotch. There you go. I couldn't remember which group it was. There's a lot of Dramfuls and AOSs and stuff, and I can't always remember which group it was on, but I always remember the discussion. Yeah, so there's a... what's the word for it? Where was I? Yes, there are lots of lovely old sherry casks that come out of these bodegas. Bodegas don't routinely just dump them. They are not sort of like used once, used twice, then thrown or turned into furniture. They are used sometimes, or in their bodega system, 9, 10, 11, 12 times, re-racking sometimes every 35, 40 years. So you're getting a cask sometimes, in some cases, that might be 300 years old. Not 300 all the time, but a lot of them might be 120 years old. A lot of them might be 80 years old. We're talking really old wood that's had a lot of time to soak up the complexities of the sherry, especially as it ages in different levels of the Sistema over time. Sometimes those bodega casks might be 8 years old. They don't get much younger than 8, from what I've heard and researched and discovered. Sam, I am a brewing. Good to see you, Sam. Dear Herbs, good to see you. Whiskey Man Sam, Sally, Whiskey Muzak, Whiskey Juzmo, Sable Scotch, Matey, good to see you all. If I can't say your name on Instagram, I'm just going to say it how it reads. So, Dear Herbs, I'm going to go with that. Dear Herbs and Whiskey Man Sam, always a pleasure. So I'm going to have a sherried whiskey whilst I'm talking about sherried whiskey. This is a Distillery 1. A fantastic distillery. Our Cellar Master's favourite distillery. Andrew's favourite distillery. This is Powerful and Warming Delight. This one came out about, I'd say 18, 24 months ago. This one's definitely from the little bit of an archive, a little bit of an older one. It was bottled for the 35th anniversary. Oh, there you go. That gives you a bit of an aging on it. So bottled for the 2018 35th anniversary of the Society. First fill, ex-Oloroso Hogshead. So, let's talk. I'm going to show you the colour on that. It's noticeably darker. It's not that dark though. It's not artificially darkened like a lot of big sherried whiskies are. This is natural colour, no caramel added, single cask strength whiskey. Pip Hills once said the best way to introduce people into the Society is, the founder of the Society once said that there wasn't much to write about, there wasn't much to say. All it was to put spirit in the glass and talk about, have a look at it. Not just even look at it, just nose it, what's going on. And people just discovered it was like single malt like no other on earth. And it is single malt. These are all single malts. They are just single cask single malts for those wondering. Nick Husick asks a very interesting question. Let me just say hello. Kalte Gaffa, good to see you. Oh, Captain, my Captain, how are you? Yes, I will be the captain of that Melbourne cruise, don't worry. What are your thoughts on marriage casks? Half bourbon, half sherry. Nick, look, I've really not had many, I don't think. I've had a lot of bourbon cask whiskies that have had an additional maturation or finish in ex-Oloroso. In this case, 2 years in ex-Oloroso, 11 years in ex-bourbon. So I'm having one right now. But I don't know if I've ever had a cask that is half bourbon, half sherry in one cask. I don't even know if that's a thing. Is that what you mean? Sorry, I'm a bit... I'm not really sure what you mean by that, sorry. Off-World Records. Benoit Jasmine, Summer on Guide joined. Good to see you. I mean, if you're meaning like finishing, Nick, by finishing I mean sort of like, yes, I love a whiskey that has a finish. It often adds a different dimension to it. It adds a different flavor profile. It takes the whiskey in a whole different direction. Some whiskies are recovered that way. Some are just already good when we get them, and some just change over time. And that's kind of the fun of the Society, isn't it? That's just how a lot of the way that it works. So there you go. So let me get back to my point though. There's two main types of sherry casks that you see in the industry. One is old bodega casks, as I was just talking about. The second one type you see, which is far more common, which is like the most common type, are seasoned casks. There's a myth out there, and you see it amongst whiskey purists, that sherry seasoning of casks, and I'll explain what that is inferior to bodega casks. I would argue the opposite. Not the opposite, but it's just incorrect. I'd argue that is entirely incorrect. So let me explain what a whiskey seasoned cask is. That is a cask of a wooden vessel, in most cases a sherry butt, that has been filled with sherry, from virgin oak to sherry, for the sole purpose of seasoning it to create it into a sherry cask. The reason that there's places that do this, and sherry seasoning houses that do this, and they do it by the truckload, tens of thousands of casks upon tens of thousands of casks in a warehouse filled with these seasoning casks. I've seen some of the photos. They are outstanding. They are absolutely ridiculous. I've not been to a seasoning house, and they don't normally allow visitors. But it's it's you see these places that are like just mental. I mean, I'm talking truly outstanding operations, and most of the time the sherry is in the casks for anywhere between 3 to 12 months to season the cask with the sherry. That's a far cry from the minimum of 8 years for bodega casks, or sometimes a lot older. As I said before, sometimes hundreds of years. Now, are they inferior because they've had lesser seasoning, because they're lesser sherry casks? I would argue not. They are cheaper, and they produce a different result. They're often much lighter, or in some case lighter in color, and often spicier in character. And there's some compounds that I won't go into right now, but there's some chemical compounds that give whiskey its spiciness, which is exciting. And that gives it a character, which is the opposite of a lot of Irish whiskey. I'm not a huge Irish whiskey fan. I've had a few Irish whiskies over the last 10 years that I have thought were remarkable, but I've had hundreds of Scotch whiskies over the last 10 years that I've thought are remarkable. So there is a huge difference there. You know what I was wondering, and this is some massive hubris here, and I don't like to do this, but you know what? I reckon I've tried a lot of whiskies in the last 10 years. I've thought about it, because the number of casks that pass my desk, the number of samples, the number of new distilleries, the number of panel things I've done, it's like, that's a lot. And that's really exciting. But at the same time, whenever that means I still get asked that question invariably at different events and stuff, especially for new members. And they'll ask, what's the world's best whiskey? That's one. And what's your favorite whiskey? That's the other one. And there's no easy answer for either of those. There's certain flavor profiles and certain styles of whiskey and certain regions of whiskey that I tend towards more than others. Not even regions. There's not even a region I tend towards more than others. But there are certain types of whiskey that like I say, I'm not a huge sherry fan. I like sherry cask whiskies. And when I taste one that is remarkable, it can transport you to another world. Here's one for you. This is a big one though. Andrew opened a bottle of 7.28, I think it was, or 26. I'm going to get the code wrong, but it was a 36-year-old Society cask from Distillery 7, which is Longmorn, and it was a full maturation in a first fill, I think. It must have been first fill. We didn't print the cask type on the label back then, but if it was either a first fill or an extremely active second fill sherry butt, unbelievable. Seriously, one of the best sherry whiskies I've ever had. Black Bamore is one of the best sherry whiskies I've also ever had. Off the top of my head, I'd have to really think about it. A 34-year-old Springbank that I once had, which was refill sherry. Unbelievable. Look, I mean, it's one of those things where when you taste them, they can transport you to another world, but because you are tasting something as a time capsule of whiskey, of course. And so let me grab some of these comments that are coming through now. Yes, that does mean after the cruise, we're going on WNA kick-ons. That's a given, Cal. That's a given. Whiskey Steam Stream, good to see you. Nick Husick, Abelard 12 blends bourbon and sherry. Yeah, so a blended batch. Sorry, Nick. Now I get what you mean. So like a single malt where they're using obviously hundreds of casks for Abelard 12. They use a mixture of bourbon and sherry casks. Balvenie 12 does the same thing. The double wood. Lots of distilleries use bourbon and sherry in their main expression. No, I was about to say Tamdu 12, but I'm pretty sure that's all sherry. Yeah, there's quite a few that do it. I don't think to be honest, Nick, most of the time I don't appreciate it. And I'll be completely honest with you, Abelard 12 is one of my least favorite core range single malts. I think it almost tastes tinny and acidic these days. It's not really, I don't think it's a great whiskey. That's not to chastise Abelard. I think Abelard does great spirit and great whiskies. Especially, if you can find an Abelard Society cask of 54 something that isn't from a first fill bourbon or even a refill sherry, unbelievable stuff. Caribbean whiskey drinker Gianni joined. Good to see you. I have an outturn question. The premium bottle Midnight Espresso. What did you think of that cask? You know what, Cal? That's a really good question. Why don't I review that before outturn? I'll do a review of that bottling, but it might be. When will it be? That'll be Friday. How about on Friday I'll do a one last outturn wrap. No, that's already after outturn, isn't it? Tricky. Look, I really like it. I think it's actually far more nuanced than the other 139 we had, the 139.4. 139.4 was like toasty treacle in a glass. It was so thick and viscous, and it was like black in the glass of the spirit. 139.5 is a little bit lighter in color, only a little bit, but it's never mind the color, because it's what's important is the flavor. The flavor on that one is far more port oriented, far more wine led, and it's just so big. It's such a big whiskey, but you do get espresso notes in it, which I love. Una mas, por favor. Good to see you. Yasalawami 26. So many newcomers tonight. This is great. Sable Scotch says 139.5 was a little unbalanced my palate, but let's try it again. Yeah, Sable, my problem with 139.5 was only that I compared it to 139.4. They're just totally different. They're chalk and cheese. If you taste 139.5, I think, in isolation, on its own, it's one of the most remarkable single casks out of that distillery. Monarch Perth, good to see you. Mr. Mike Sazali, good to see you. As long as the spirit works with the cask, that's exactly right. Evening review. Is it worth getting? Yeah, I'm not doing reviews, Robert. Come on, you know by now, Rob. I'm not reviewing whiskey because the reviews are already all done. I've already talked about this before. The two reasons I don't do reviews. One is because what I'm tasting right now, in this case, distillery 1.207 in this case, you don't have in front of you right now. So why would I talk about something that you don't also get to enjoy? There's already some great reviews online about this. There's already some great reviews elsewhere about every whiskey we do. Second reason is all the tasting notes in an outturn are already in the outturn. They are expert tasting notes. Anything I add to that seems almost like superfluous. And I'm probably going to be influenced by those tasting notes, if I'm being honest. Is it worth getting, or is there something better planned for March WNA that did not get it or went fast? Calte, look, and you're welcome to get one, Calte. I think it's a marvellous whiskey. Whiskey and Element do have a bottle of it if you want to try it by the dram to confirm whether you want to get a bottle or not. However, we do have some other premium livery and some other Vaults collection releases coming out later this year. Whether it's March or April, we're not quite there yet. But we'll see how we go. We're getting close. But there's some great releases coming up this year, which we're just looking at ordering at the moment. And actually, there is one premium release coming, which will be either March or April, which I'm super excited about. And I can't tell you what it is yet. But I'll tell you it's a peated whiskey, and it is super exciting that we're getting a good allocation as well. Getting a good chunk of them, which is really exciting. Aussie.1. Some Rowan guy. Look, I'm going to say the same thing, Rowan, I say to every time people mention Australian whiskies. You've heard me talk about Australian whiskey on the channel here before. And especially I have been quite critical of many Australian whiskies before, because I just don't think in the long game what we bottle has to be great. It has to be the .1 or .2, etc. The first couple of casks out of the next two distilleries out of Australia that we work with have to be absolute world beaters. If we were to bottle something that we weren't entirely satisfied with and the panel didn't give a raving score to, then you're going to get something that, yes, is a bit of a piece of history, but not a very good one. It's all we've only ever cared at the society what's inside the bottle. That's why we don't spend ridiculous money on packaging, and what we spend money on is casks and spirit and making sure what goes into the bottle is best. And we don't want to bottle something that we would be not happy with. So I'll be completely transparent with you. A bunch of samples from a bunch of distilleries has been through panel already. They've been assessed for whether they are good enough for an international audience, and for an Australian audience, we'll get the majority of the cask, of course. But just like, does this stand up to society standards on a blind panel? And they assess, they're not just like, Scotch oriented and taste an Australian whiskey and say, oh, that's wrong. This panel are tasting Indian whiskies, Welsh whiskies, American whiskies, Japanese whiskies, all over the world, and going, yep, that's what we're after. That's this is a quality level that society members will be happy with. Yes, a Vault 1 and a Matt favour. Yes, that'll do well for when I finally finish your PhD and crack a good cast. Yes, and I think you're going to really like what's coming up then, Cal. We've got some awesome things coming up that we'll do that favour for you. Of course, you've asked for us to do a bit of a squiggle. Are they likely to want to sell their great casks themselves? Well, that's the other thing. It's also like Whiskey Steens. That's a really good question. there are a lot of distilleries already in Australia doing a lot of vatting and stuff, so a lot of them won't know or identify single casks in particular that are doing really well. So that's not so much the concern. It's more to do with just supply and demand. We're talking like most distilleries in Australia are sort of, a lot of them are between that sort of 35 to 50,000 litres a year. That doesn't even register as a blip as the smallest distilleries in Scotland. So put that into perspective. Even the biggest malt whiskey distilleries in Australia, which would be Starward, Archie Rose, Hellier's Road, they're even just those three, you'd be looking at, and I mean like public facing that have a product as well, not just selling, but like they have their output, all three of those distilleries combined, is still less than even some of the smallest distilleries in Scotland still. So putting that in perspective, all three of them combined would be sort of a small to medium-sized distillery in Scotland. Would be sort of like probably a Springbank or Glen Scotia in size and capacity. Off the top of my head, I don't have capacities in front of me, and my malt whiskey yearbook isn't within arm's reach, so I'm not going to worry about fact-checking that one. You can do that for me. Archie Rose will have some. Yeah, well, I mean, we're working with a lot of distilleries. Una más, por favor. We're working with a lot of distilleries. Yeah, tasty stuff coming over the next few years. That's indeed correct. We're really looking forward to it. Lark, yes, some great stuff coming out of Lark. Starwood, Archie Rose, and Lark all good contiguous sales into one. Look, we are working with a lot of distilleries, but if you want a really sort of like, I can't tell you which ones, but as a little tip, I'll give you one little tip. If you look at the distilleries in other countries that we've worked with, it's often not the big guys. If you look at America, we started with. Recently, we've been bottling a few casks from Few Distillery in Chicago and Rocktown Distillery in Arkansas. So there's things like that happening, which it's like, it's more about the quality of the output rather than the size of the distillery, but it comes down to a working relationship with them. And of course, it benefits them and it benefits us. And so we're all working towards it, but it also needs to be a price that suits as well. We're going to have an Australian whiskey, let's be honest, it's going to be young. It's going to be a 3-something, maybe 4-year-old whiskey, or something like that. It's not going to be an old cask because they don't exist. They did for a long while, but that, like I say, it gets hollowed out there from the middle, and even some of the older stuff tastes sulfured and garbage. And I can say that objectively. I'm not even saying a distiller or anything, but we tasted some old casks from a distillery that were just terrible. So you just say, well, let's say it's going to be a youngish whiskey that we first bottle from these distilleries that we're working with. Do you think, it's like it's going to be, if it's going to be young, what, is that going to be some of these distilleries charging $350, $450 for a whiskey? That seems absurd. That seems a bit like, that's not really sustainable. We're going to see that market correction that even Andrew was talking about on his podcast the other day. You know what? That's a good segue to stop talking about Australian whiskey. Andrew was recently on the Living Proof podcast online. Check out our Facebook group. He's posted a link. It's actually a really interesting listen. I'm not saying that like, I was expecting it not to be. I'll say that like it's a really interesting listen. It is really interesting. It's great. Have a listen to what he's got going on there. Society Few is lovely, Rob. I've still got one bottle, I think, of B4.2, I think, or B4.1. I can't remember. They're just lovely casks. Like seriously, like a polished ruby in a glass, just really rounded and delicious. I'm trying not to open that yet. I opened one of them, but there is a 140.2 in the works. Calte, yes, there's a few things in the works. But apparently those McHenry blokes are right. Yeah, the Archie Rose is 5 minutes old. Yeah, you're not far off there. Some wrong guy. Yeah, Sullivan Cove, imagine the price, God. Yeah. Well, if we did actually, yeah. I mean, anyway. Do distilleries need to approach single cask maturation in a special way compared to the casks they use to blend with their other casks? You know what? That's a bloody good question. Do distilleries need to approach single cask maturation in a special way compared to the casks used to blend with other casks? No, not normally. I can answer that now. Not normally. There are some distilleries that put spirit down at different proofs for different projects, and they will often be sold as single casks or project releases and things like that from the distilleries. Or, sometimes, some of the single casks might come through a third party through that distillery or might come through different means, but generally not, no. They're casks that are just casks and they're filled at the same rate and the same maturation policy as all the others, especially for bigger distilleries. But a lot of them often go through smaller distilleries often have a different maturation policy and different way of how they do things. Okay, well, I've been talking for a good 20-something minutes, 25 minutes, and I'm going to call that a night. And I haven't had a taste of this yet, only nose. But it's everything I wanted in a good sherried whiskey, which Distillery One do very well. And we've got some lovely Distillery Ones coming through the pipe very shortly as well. So that's all from me. I'll talk a bit more about Malt of the Month. But just to let you know, for those who are interested, I'm hosting an event tomorrow night. So we'll see if I'm able to do a live stream somewhere tomorrow, which would be good. And then Thursday is our outturn preview. And Friday will be the post-outturn live, which will be good fun. Check out your, make sure you got your login and all sorted for this Friday. You can join up to be a member anytime and make the most of your membership by making the most of Outturn and our amazing experiences. Go to the events page.com.au/events and smws.com.au/events. Lots of great events coming up for members all around the country. The Tassie event will be up live very shortly. Just a few last details to confirm. Thank you so much, and I'll speak to you soon. Cheers.